And I think at this point, we should definitely get into our muckraking.
Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction. The drop in unemployment is one more sign that the economy is strengthening.
So, Glenn Greenwald dealt with in an episode maybe 3 days ago, definitely this week, or maybe at the end of last week. It was this week. It was February 6th. Was 2 days ago. Pro-war propagandists, how bloodthirsty media push us toward every new war. And again, I saw similarities between what he was covering and what I was covering, so I wanted to bring his ideas in and have a conversation with him digitally.
Media was anti-Bush and anti-Cheney. And again, I'm going to leave that to history. I think it's quite disputable. If you look at the 2000 election, for example, the media loved to try and turn it into a question of with whom would you rather have a beer, George W. Bush or Al Gore. They kind of like Bush, just they found him a more likable person. Gore was notoriously kind of hectoring and alienating. He had a very cold personality the media disliked. And they often openly acknowledged that they found Bush more appealing, that they had a warmer sensation to George Bush. But when it came to the war on terror and the Iraq war, I think people have forgotten how quickly the U.S. media united behind that entire Bush-Cheney agenda. A very big reason why the war in Iraq and the war on terror generally was able to be sold not only to conservatives who naturally supported it because it was being sponsored by the Republican Party under Bush and Cheney, but large numbers of the sector of American liberalism, to the point that 80% of Americans approved of George W. Bush throughout the end of 2001 and into 2002, and 70% or more of Americans supported the Iraq War at the time that it was launched, was because there had been so much penetration of support for the Bush-Cheney neocon war on terror and Iraq war into sectors of American liberalism, and that was led by the American liberal media. It would have been impossible to convert 70% of Americans into supporters of the war on terror and the Iraq war without having not Fox News behind that agenda, although they certainly were, but without having the most trusted liberal voices: Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, John Kerry, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Yorker. The journals that liberals trusted the most were completely unified behind every proposed new war. They loved it. And to this day...
And there was also a conflation of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda. There was an inflation of all of these things. Excuse me, not an inflation, a conflation of all of these things. And the same type of conflation occurred with the beginning of the Gulf War in the 90s with Saddam Hussein, if memory serves me correctly.
That, more than anything, is their most predictable attribute. Outside of the culture war, where they're reliably left liberal, for the reasons I described, the demographic reasons, when it comes to the more substantive questions of economic policy and foreign policy, they're not leftists as much as they are devotees to status quo power and institutional authority. And it's almost impossible to overstate how pro-war the employees of large media corporations have always been. And that's the reason why the only place one can now find dissent and opposition to things like the war in Ukraine, and even the attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and before that, the regime change operation undertaken by NATO to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, came from Fox News. There's a sector of the American right, the populist right in media.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Outside of the culture war, where they're reliably left liberal, for the reasons I described, the demographic reasons, when it comes to the more substantive questions of economic policy and foreign policy, they're not leftists as much as they are devotees to status quo power and institutional authority. And it's almost impossible to overstate how pro-war the employees of large media corporations have always been. And that's the reason.
If you see a commercial for Northrop Grumman or some other military product producing company, you should be insulted. You should feel insulted. And I feel like the sentiment is going that way with not only particular countries, but humanity. There is no tolerance for wars for the most part, especially amongst millennials, not unlike myself. And so there has been a change in government wherein there was a declaration of war in years past when wars occurred. But at this point, there is no declaration. That declaration must happen by way of the executive branch. So it disempowers the executive branch to not require that declaration.
Reason why the only place one can now find dissent and opposition to things like the war in Ukraine and even the attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and before that the regime change operation undertaken by NATO to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in Libya.
Ukraine, Syria, and Gaddafi and Libya. Ukraine, Syria, and Libya connected by Greenwald. This is, beyond poetry. It's logic.
The whole notion of logic
Came from Fox News. There's a sector of the American right, the populist right in media, that is more anti-war than any other sector of the media, which continues to be as fervently and passionately in favor of any new war that's on the table. And to demonstrate just how impossible it is to overstate that, I want to show you an interview that Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky did with CNN host Kate Baldwin in 2017 when the media was indignant over Donald Trump's refusal to do much more than he was doing to engage in regime change in Syria. They had watched what happened in Iraq, where we overthrew the regime of Saddam Hussein, and in its wake brought nothing other than extreme chaos and instability in the region that even Tony Blair acknowledges is what gave rise to ISIS. It brought almost no benefit to the United States. The Iraqi governments that were elected were far more favorable to Iran than they were to the United States. They were far more favorable to Iran than Saddam Hussein was. They strengthened Iran, they strengthened ISIS. Even after watching...
Yeah, and in one breath I thought, oh, this is too historical, right? This is too far back in the past, and it doesn't apply as much, even though there are issues in Syria and in Iraq and Iran still. This is just from 20 years ago, so it really is not important. But what spawned me covering this was not this particularly. I heard it and I was, it caught my ear. But what really helped me or encouraged me to do this story was that there's a February 5th article from Al Mayadeen echoing these sentiments. And this is just from 2 days ago, right? So there are, on multiple fronts, we're seeing a rehashing of the West's exploitations in this area. So let's read through the same Iraq war lie used in Syria, says Mekdad. And this is the same foreign minister. This is the same foreign minister of Syria that was mentioned in prior articles that we've read today. 20 years after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad recalls how U.S. President George Bush lied about Iraq's alleged WMDs to launch the invasion. This is almost verbatim of what Greenwald was saying. Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad recalled that the Bush administration was determined to attack Iraq for a number of reasons beyond Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction, right? On a day like, I mean, if it was just for that, right? Of course, Bush administration was determined to attack Iraq for a number of reasons beyond Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. But even if it was just for that reason, that wouldn't be enough because, of course, they were not real. On a day like today, 20 years ago, and near the Syrian seat where I was sitting in the Security Council, the then U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell, staged a scene of manipulation and lies to justify the U.S. invasion of Iraq on the pretext that it possesses weapons of mass destruction, Mekdad tweeted.
The whole notion of logic.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Mekdad added that Powell presented audio recordings, satellite images, testimonials, and documents at the time, claiming that they are evidence rather than speculation, facts, and well-documented information, and showing a small tube containing Iraqi-produced biological substances capable of killing tens of thousands of people.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious. Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Of course, it became clear that everything he put forward was mere unsubstantiated lies. And Powell himself described what he said before the Security Council as a disgrace. But sadly, Iraq was invaded on the basis of these lies, and everyone knows the disastrous results left by the invasion of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by U.S. forces on their allies in Iraq, the foreign minister stressed. Mekdad emphasized that the U.S. and its agents in France, Britain, and Germany are engaging in the same games and lies to launch the war against Syria, just like they did in Iraq 20 years ago, under the guise of its possession of weapons of mass destruction. He advised the world to learn from history and not allow the U.S. and its allies, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, to repeat similar deception or use false claims to justify interfering in the affairs of other countries and undermining their security, stability, and prosperity. Bush lied, people died. U.S. President Joe Biden was one of the 77 senators who gave President George Bush the authority to use force in Iraq back in October 2002. This is a salient point, right? This is a very salient point. Biden was with it as well. Biden was with it as well. U.S. military officials admitted that some troops committed abuses, claiming always independently of senior commanders, and claimed that more than 300 criminal investigations were opened in response to accusations of a prisoner mistreatment, and that 100 soldiers were subjected to court-martial proceedings and administrative punishments. Washington, along with coalition forces, invaded Iraq in March 2003 after toppling Saddam Hussein under the pretext of disarming Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. So there was a conflation of weapons of mass destruction in Saddam Hussein, and then later on there was a conflation of Saudi Arabia, 9/11, Osama bin Laden, and Iraq. The U.S. invasion of Iraq left at least 5 million Iraqi orphans, murdered over 100,000 Iraqis, forced 4 to 5 million Iraqis to flee their homes, displaced ancient Iraqi minority groups, and destroyed much of Iraq's infrastructure and economy. And so there we have it. Let's go back to a bit more of this Greenwald.
Everything that happened in that Iraq war, they were desperate to due to Syria, what they did to Iraq, which was overthrow Bashar al-Assad, even though obviously Assad was not in any way
the whole notion of logic.
I mean, how paralleled can these two pieces be, right?
And anybody who even expressed any kind of hesitation was despised openly by the media. So let me show you this interview. It was actually Congressman Massey himself who reminded me this weekend of this interview. I don't remember having seen it the first time, but it's very common and illustrative of just how explicit they are. Let's take a look.
Hey, Congressman, as you are against intervention. You say that is what you hear from your constituents, and you say that's what you heard from your constituents previously. But as you sit here today and you see these images coming out of the slaughter of innocent children, does that change your view?
Well, with all due respect to the senator from Arizona, he's wrong, and he's not.
The context was that John McCain, as always, and this was the reason he was the most beloved figure by the media, had come out along with Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and his standard crowd, along with neocons like Joe Lieberman, and they were demanding that the U.S. should engage in regime change. There you see on the screen, McCain has said that the U.S. should dedicate itself to removing Assad. This is in April 2017, so less than 3 months after Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. John McCain was already undercutting him, saying that we should immediately go, despite all the problems that the United States had, despite McCain having watched the havoc that he and his friends wreaked in Iraq and then in Libya, and go and do the same thing to Syria. The U.S. should dedicate itself not to help the American people, but to removing Assad. So that was the context, and they were throwing that in Thomas Massey's face, like John McCain, the good Republican, says that this is what we should do.
Expressing the will of the American people. But I hope that the senator and I can agree that President Trump cannot unilaterally attack a country. He cannot commit an act of war against a sovereign nation without a vote in Congress. So this really isn't up to Rex Tillerson or the president at this point.
If the president of Syria is committing...
Do you see how she just ignored that? She's not the slightest bit interested in what he said. It's kind of an important point. There's this thing we have in the United States called the Constitution. It governs how our government is supposed to function. And the decision about whether to go into a new war, which obviously is what this would be, it would be a regime change war in Syria, is not left unilaterally to Donald Trump. It's a vote that is supposed to be undertaken by the Congress. You can't just demand that Trump go and start a new war in Syria, even though that is how our government works.
And another point that just came to mind, because I covered the Pakistani story yesterday, and I've been thinking about Imran Khan's situation. Imran Khan was supported by, was propagandized in ways by Western media as being, something in between the quote unquote misdirected barbaricness of non-Westernness and the civility of Westernness. And he wore a suit, tie, same thing with Assad, right? But once these people were in power, once these leaders garnered power, they were just part of the system again, a part of that system that was barbaric and corrupt and not Western. So maybe we should read Edward Said's Orientalism. I don't know.
In 2010, 2011, when Obama finally got persuaded by Hillary Clinton and Samantha Power and Susan Rice to join the French-German, or rather the French-British war in Libya, the regime change operation in Libya, to overthrow Gaddafi, there was no vote in the Congress to authorize that war. In fact, there was a vote about whether that war should be authorized, and the Republicans who had the majority in the House voted against its authorization. Obama went ahead and did it anyway. So it's not even just that he lacked the congressional authority to fight that war in Libya. It's that the House actually voted against it. Now, if the House really meant it, they could have and would have done a lot more. They could have defunded that war. They didn't do any of that. But nobody cares. Nobody cares. You see what he just said. You're demanding Trump start a war, but he doesn't actually have that power. And all she wants to say is, but what about these images of these children? She just wants this war at all cost.
crimes against humanity, slaughtering his own people. Do you think there is something short of going to war with Syria that you can support?
Is denying humanitarian aid slaughtering people?
The whole notion of logic.
Your fellow Republican, Adam Kinzinger, says yes, there is something short of that. You can ground Assad's Air Force. You can crater the airstrips that the Air Force is taking off from to commit these atrocities. Can you?
Look at how excited she was there. This was Adam Kinzinger back in 2017 saying, we don't have time to go to war with Syria. We don't have to have a full-scale war yet. Instead, let's just kind of crater their airspace, crater their runways, and create a no-fly zone in Syria, telling Assad where he is and isn't permitted to fly within his own country, which obviously means two things. One, that you have to back up that direction so that if Assad does decide to go fly where the United States government has somehow told him he's not allowed to fly, you have to then go and shoot down his planes, which means you're, of course, involved in a war. When you impose a no-fly zone on another country, automatically you're at war with that country. But also, Assad's key ally, Syria's key ally for decades, has been Russia. And Russia was their ally at this time. So you would not only be risking war with Syria, but also with Russia. And over what? Who governs the question of Syria? But you listen to her, and she doesn't care about any of this. She says, okay, well, if you won't give me my full-scale war yet, let's just go and do some minor things that Adam Kinzinger suggests, like crater their runways and tell Assad that if we see him flying in places we told him he can't, we're going to shoot down his planes.
Can I go with that?
Well, I can't speak about classified information on TV, but I can tell you, according to the Washington Post, we've been spending $1 billion a year in funding the rebels in Syria to no good effect, frankly.
Right, but that's not funding the rebels. What do you think about grounding? What do you think about grounding Assad's Air Force?
Well, you know, we had testimony from a military expert in front of Congress that said that's a virtual act of war in Syria, and that we would be at war with the Russians at that point. I think it's a bad idea.
Earlier today, Congressman.
Just watch as this interview unfolds, too. She doesn't even bother to hide with her facial expressions, with her tone of voice, how disgusted she is by his aunt. Now, she's somebody who, if you went up to her and said, well, you clearly wanted this war, she would say, I don't want war. I don't want or not want war. That's not my job. I'm a reporter. I don't have political opinions. I'm just there to report facts. And all you have to do is look at this one interview to see how much that's a fraud, what a farce that is for CNN's reporters to make that claim. I mean, this is nothing. She's berating him. And it gets worse and worse as we go through the interview, that she can barely contain her disgust. And all he's really saying is, I don't think we should start a new war with Russia over Syria. And I don't think it would help the Syrian people if we did. And I think we should focus on our own problems at home. That's not exactly a radical viewpoint, although in this world where she's just so hungry for war, it's the only reason people will watch CNN is if there's a war. It excites people to get to talk about war. She's not going to go fight in it, of course. No one in her family is going to go fight in it. That's for a different kind of American to go do. But she's in her studio. She wants that war. She wants those ratings. She loves it. And she's furious that he won't give it to her.
Vanna, she's a little Syrian girl who's become really the voice of...
Okay, so she's going to now whip out the big gun. She's going to show us a Syrian child and make him tell this child, show us a...
pleading for help. What do you say to her, Congressman?
I think what she's asking for is something that all children should enjoy. And I think that our intervention in Syria has prolonged the civil war, and it is not helping there. President Trump campaigned on a more restrained a more restrained foreign policy, and I hope that's what we see. And, you know, we haven't created a better school environment for the children in Iraq, frankly, by destabilizing that country. And I don't think it serves the children of Syria or anybody in the United States to further destabilize Syria.
So you say you see these, you hear that plea from her, you see the images coming out of Syria, and you think the best policy for the United States right now is to do nothing.
What I'm saying.
Apparently, the United States is supposed to go to war anytime they can find a child in some country to say, we don't like our government is repressing us, and we want you to come in, invade our country and to save us. That's the standard she's creating. You could pick a child in any country. You could put a Yemeni child on the screen and say, we want the United States to stop arming the Saudis. Or you can find another Yemeni child and say, we want the United States to come and prevent Iran from arming our country. You could manipulate the public discourse in any way like this. You could find a child in eastern Ukraine to say, we don't like President Zelensky. We don't feel like we should be subject to the rule of this pro-EU government that was installed by the West. We want to be a part of Moscow. Or you can put a different kid on in Ukraine to say, we want the U.S. to come and help us fight. This is grotesque, this kind of propaganda, but that's how desperate they get.
Is we might end up making the situation worse if we launch airstrikes, if we against their airplanes, against hard targets on the ground. So we really need to step back and take a good look at this. The first casualty of war is the truth, and it's hard to know exactly what's happening in Syria right now. I'd like to know specifically how that release of chemical gas, if it did occur, and it looks like it did, how that occurred. Because frankly, I don't think Assad would have done that. It does not serve his interests. It would tend to draw us into that civil war even further.
Who do you think is behind it? Who do you think is behind it?
You know, you've got a war going on over there. Supposedly that airstrike was on an ammo dump. And so I don't know if it was released because there was gas stored in the ammo dump or not. That's plausible. I'm not saying that's what I think happened, but
You're more inclined to believe the position of what Bashar al-Assad is saying and what the Russians are saying right now than more inclined to believe what even your colleagues here in the United States believe is.
Because there's only two positions, right? In a polemicized world, there are only two positions. There's not this side, that side, and another side, and another side. There aren't multiple versions or vantage points or perceptions. There are only two. There is a subjective opinion, and then there's an opinion that is not the subjective opinion for people like this. And, you know, you got other people like this, because people like this, they dye their hair, they equivocate between war and humanitarian aid, between military aid and humanitarian aid. It's problematic, and it's you know, it invalidates the other things, any other things that person might say.
It's truth that this is Assad, and what human rights observers over there say is Assad?
I don't think it would have served Assad's purposes to do a chemical attack on his people. So it's hard for me to understand why he would do that if he did.
I mean, did these people live through the Iraq War? Do they remember that all of the people that were supposed to blindly believe the CIA, the Pentagon, America's newspapers, all of these Western institutions of authority who said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, they all got it wrong, either by wanting to lie on purpose or just by being horrifically mistaken about one of the most important questions, if not the most important question of that generation. And less than 15 years later, she's disgusted by the fact that he won't blindly swallow whatever claims are made by the Pentagon or the CIA, which wants to lead the United States into another war. Just how can you question what your own government is telling you? Even though less than 15 years earlier, we all know that they deliberately deceived us, that they have so many times throughout history. But this is the mind of a journalist that says you don't question what the United States government tells you when it comes time for them to want a new war. You just get into line behind it. Now, Congresswoman Massey did allude to the fact that it wasn't like the United States was doing nothing. Under President Obama, the Obama administration authorized at least $1 billion every year to the CIA to engage in clandestine activity designed to destabilize the Assad government and to try and facilitate his removal. They were arming the Free Syrian Army, which ultimately gave way to the real fighters against Assad, which happened to be ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So the United States happened to find itself on the same side of the war as Al-Qaeda.
Free Syrian Army became Al-Qaeda. The United States and other Western countries armed the Free Syrian Army and destabilized the region. It's happened numerous times with different outfits, different countries.
Less than 13 years earlier, having said that our arch enemy, to which we're completely devoted to its destruction, is Al-Qaeda. Now the United States wanted to go and fight on the same side of the war as Al-Qaeda and risk a direct war with Russia over Syria. So just by questioning that, she's earning his disgust. Just to underscore how common this was, I mean, by no means was she alone. A separate reporter from CNN, Clarissa Ward, actually admitted how enraged she was under the Obama administration that they refused to do more to have a full-scale war to take out Bashar al-Assad.
And so these are the, well, they just mentioned Assad.
Here you see the headline from CBS News. Author and war correspondent Clarissa Ward on reporting from conflict zones in her new book, Intelligence Matters. Here she admits the following, quote, I wrote Ben Rhodes, that's Obama's senior national security official, an email to his official White House account, and I said, quote, Dear Ben, I hope you're sleeping soundly as Aleppo burns. At least we have the Russians to sort it out. Best wishes, Clarissa. Does that sound anything remotely like an objective journalist to you? Goading him and expressing hatred for him because the Obama administration didn't start a full-scale new war in Syria, just funded the CIA at $1 billion a year to do it. She then said in this interview about her book, quote, as I sent it, there was a voice saying, you know, this is really not a very professional thing to do, Clarissa. You think? But I think you're allowed in the course of your career one story, or where you can just be a human being as well. And I just got sick of hearing the Obama administration trying to pretend that this policy was some kind of a stroke of genius and that it was sort of very well thought out. And
just one story. One story. I just need one story, and then I'll just go back to having integrity, right? That's what she's saying. She's saying she needs one story where she doesn't have integrity, and then she goes back to having integrity. I need one country. I need one invasion. You know what? Can we just have one nuclear bomb? Just one. All right, you asked for it.
Intentional policy, when I knew from having interviewed Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, from having had previous conversations with Ben Rhodes, I knew this wasn't a well thought out policy, but rather a kind of series of improvised decisions to try to avert, getting sucked into a quagmire. Isn't that, by the way, Intelligence Matters is the name of the podcast, not the book. Isn't that something that you actually should want the U.S. government to do, avoid getting sucked into a quagmire? Because if you get sucked into a quagmire, it means that hundreds of billions of dollars get lost, thousands of American lives get lost, you end up killing the children of those countries. And she's, like our CNN colleague, the one we just watched, so disgusted at the idea that the Obama administration was trying to avoid getting sucked into a quagmire in Syria the way we did in Iraq. Remember, Obama was elected based on a promise not to repeat the mistakes of Iraq. Just like, as Congressman Massey said, Trump was elected on a platform to avoid these kinds of regime change wars. She doesn't care at all what the American people want. None of these people in the media do. They want their wars. And I forgot how explicit they were about admitting how hungry and desperate they are for it. Now, again, let's go back to the Iraq War for a second and look.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, journalism, journalistic integrity, honesty and humanitarian empathy, human empathy. That can be the summation of this segment. And